of Contemporary Jew and the Melton Center for Jewish Education. It's a privilege for me to warmly welcome Professor Leonard Saxe. Professor Saxe from Brandeis University is a social psychologist as well as a methodologist with special interest in contemporary Jewish studies. He is the director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies and also the director of the Steinhardt Research Institute at his university. The scholarly interest and research of Professor Saxe are very wide, but over the last several years he has mainly focused on the sociodemography of the American Jewry, on Jewish education in the United States, and on American Jewry-Israel relations. In the major project which is attached to these issues, and in which Professor Saxe serves as a principal investigator, is the longitudinal study of the birthright Israel. And it is within this project that he co-authored a very well-received book entitled 10 Days of a Birthright Israel, A Journey in Young Adult Identity. This book, out of some 250 publications of Professor Saxe, tells the story of an intensive educational program which is designed to connect these young adults to their heritage, and whether and how this program fulfills its goals is the topic of the presentation today. Professor Saxe will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion.
תודה רבה, Uzi. I apologize for that. I hope I'm understandable. This is a lecture, but I'm pleased to be interrupted. If I don't want to be interrupted, I'll just continue talking. If you're something you don't understand or you have a pressing question, feel free to ask it. So what I'd like to do in the next 30, 40 minutes is to talk about Taglit, and the particular angle that I'd like to take for today's discussion is the role that Taglit is playing, the role that it could play, and the role of Jewish education, of diasporans in general, in changing the nature and structuring the nature of the relationship between the diaspora communities and Israel. Can you just, before I get too far in it, I presume everyone knows of Taglit. You listen to the radio occasionally, so you know, you see the buses. How many of you feel that you know a lot about Taglit and how it operates educationally? So only a few people. Okay, so apologies to you. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how Taglit operates. I'd like to start in framing this by taking this term, got reversed on this. This thinks that it's English, so it has to do it in a reverse way. But Shlilat Gola, that the denigration of the Gola is an issue that, again, at least for diaspora Jews, seems to have reemerged. It's like a virus or maybe a bacteria that grows in new forms. And the recent controversy, I better stand here, have to ask for extra pay for being the door person as well as the speaker, this idea and the controversy that recently arose over advertisements trying to bring home Israelis or Redeem who are in the States was premised on the notion that life in the diaspora, Jewish life in the diaspora, is impossible. That to live in the diaspora is to be married to a non-Jew, is to celebrate Christmas, is to reject all of Jewish tradition. So that's the denigration of the Gola from this side of the ocean. From the American side, the North American side, the issue is more political, and the debate has been about Americans distancing themselves from Israel, and in particular the next generation becoming disengaged from Israel, presumably because the politics of young American Jews aren't and don't match the politics of Israel. Now, the absurdity of that, because what are the politics of Israel? If somebody can figure that out, they should get some kind of a prize. But the idea is that the diaspora and Israel have this tenuous relationship. The question that I want to try to answer today is whether Jewish and a special version of Jewish education, Israel education, can play a role and can change that situation. Should we wait or not? One of my mentors in graduate school gave me 3 rules for teaching. So the first one was always have a room that's too small for your class, because that sense of intimacy will increase. The second was always pick a textbook that you don't like, so that you can look really good that they won't like, so that you can look really good. And the third one is always start on time, so that those people who come late really feel bad. So I've got 2 out of the 3 covered today. So for those who don't know about Taglit, or don't know the details of Taglit, its original goals, and it's actually, interestingly, for a program that's lasted, it's almost going to celebrate bar or bat mitzvah, is to reinforce Jewish identity, to enhance about Israel, of Israel, and to promote a sense of peoplehood, Klal Yisrael. It's not a political program. In other words, it's not designed to create supporters of Israel or to ideologically engage them. It is a Jewish identity and Jewish community building program. How does it do it? First of all, it targets 18 to 26-year-old. The original goal was to target unaffiliated Jews. Turns out most participants have some formal Jewish education. I'll show you that in a second. And it was to be non-didactic and experiential. And the central piece of the program didn't actually start this way, but in part because of our research has become this way, that the central part of the program are mifgashim, mostly with chayalim, 5 or 6 of them who spend at least half of the 10 days with the group. I'll say a word about the unaffiliated. Again, the goal was to find all of these Jews who were in danger of assimilating, who hadn't gotten Jewish education, who hadn't had an opportunity to come to Israel. And I don't know if any of you know the philanthropist Michael Steinhardt. He, along with Charles Bronfman, took the idea. Does anybody know where the idea for Taglit came from? Whose idea it was? Yossi Balin, right. And in fact, Yossi Balin initially proposed it, actually as a way to get rid of the Saknut, the Jewish agency created with the thing that he called Beit-Israel, and redirect the funding to educating diaspora youth. But it took Michael Steinhardt and Charles Bronfman in 1999 to establish the program. And again, the goal was, quote unquote, unaffiliated young people. And a couple of years ago, I was with Michael, probably at this time of year. There was a busload of Taglit young people, and he sees coming off the bus several individuals with kippot. And he pokes me and he says, "Len," he says, "look at those people." And I said, "Yes, look at those people." And he said, "I didn't pay my money to send those people on a trip." And I looked at Michael and I said, "Michael, can you imagine a bus full of people like you?" And the idea, and we'll talk about it later, is that it is the diversity of the group, the fact that they come from all walks of Jewish life, from the totally unengaged, uneducated, unwashed, to people who had day school experience, is very important to the program. Let me talk now about a little bit of, we'll touch on the demography of this. This is a very complicated chart that we've been trying to develop over time. And what we tried to track, and perhaps because I'm a social psychologist by training, and I see people as part of larger entities, it's a really critical issue for me. What is the penetration of birthright? In other words, how far into the Jewish community is it reaching? Now, one of the problems is there's not agreement about the denominator, how many people there are in the Jewish community. But taking relatively conservative estimates of the size of the community, what we now think is that for the cohort born in 1985, who in the last year aged out of eligibility for Taglit, in the United States, Barzot Brit, close to 25% of the age-eligible Jewish cohort participated in Taglit. In Canada, the number is over 40%. It's a really, really extraordinary number. And the goal of Taglit is within the next 5 years to have this number go up to 50%. And so the idea is that after the next 5 years, the next 4 years, Taglit is going to be on track to making sure that the majority of young Jews in America, by the time they reach the normal marital age, have had the experience of Jewish education in the land of Israel. That's the goal. Now, in Canada, they are much closer. These are actually 2010 numbers. I haven't updated them with 2011 figures. This number is now closer to, it's actually over 200,000. Total around the world, there have been close to 300,000 participants, and this summer, or maybe even later this winter, they will reach that 300,000 mark. Questions so far? Comments? Yeah.
Just clarify, presumably there are folks who are not eligible to go on the program,
Right,
who also have been to Israel in other programs.
right.
You know what percentage?
So in fact, they're unlikely to get to 50% through this, but they will get to 50% of the eligible population. And a very interesting thing has happened. Although some people claim that Taglit has destroyed the high school programs, in fact, high school programs are now sending more kids than ever to Israel, many more than were going in 1999 before the start of the program. And what has happened is that seeing Israel as an essential part of the Jewish education of at least North American Jews is the normative sense now. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a dual citizen, man, but I'm asking myself, what is I can see how, I mean, where's the fluctuation about Israel? I mean, how do American Jews need to see Israel as part of their identity without being in it? I mean, how does that happen? How do you, it's like a double-edged sword almost, I mean, you know what I mean? So I'm asking, how do they dictate this pro-Zionist content in American Jewish life? I mean, how can you be with Israel voting for a Democratic senator or a Republican senator in a certain state who's pro-Israel more? How does that work? Through Taglit. That goes back to, you said, do we know the action of Taglit? So I want to know how Taglit is doing that.
Okay. Can I, this question, let me table, and if I don't answer it by the end, remind me and I will try to do an answer. Okay. Just give you a picture of who participates. These are data from last summer. Colors came out a little odd here, but basically what it shows, and probably the most important piece, is that about 20% of the people who participate have never prior to Taglit been exposed to any formal or informal Jewish education. And in fact, these data are supported. One of the standard questions that we ask is knowledge of the Ivrit. And about 20% of the group says they can't distinguish Aleph from Bet. About 50% say that they know how to read Hebrew, but they don't understand it at all. Those are the, if you will, typical B'nai Mitzvah in the liberal movements. And then there's another, where are we, 20 to 30% who have some language facility with Hebrew. But this is a critical number. The vast majority, 50%, slightly over 50%, have gone to what we call, probably incorrectly, but we call it Hebrew school, and they've gone one or more times a week. So what's the overall evaluation? We've done this now with, I can tell you about the methodology of our study in a little bit, but we've done this repeatedly and we get the same basic findings. One of the questions about Taglit is it 10 days of partying and drinking, and especially with the mifgashim, does that mean sex, drugs, dancing, whatever? And there is some of that. These are young adults. But the dominant thing that they say is that they learned a great deal as a result of the program. At the same time, they consider it fun. What's particularly important, and this predicts lots of other things, is that the vast majority see their 10-day experience as life-changing. A lot of people have a hard time believing that, but in fact, I'm increasingly, and we could talk educational philosophy a little bit later, I'm increasingly of the mind that there are inflection points in people's development, that we call it a liminal experience. And one of the difficulties of liminal experiences is that a negative liminal experience is probably more difficult to undo than a positive experience changes a person. But what we know now from literally tens of thousands of the Bogrei Taglit is that this is a life-changing experience for them. They think that they have seen, quote unquote, the real Israel. For some of them it is a religious pilgrimage. And for a very, very small group of people, they were disappointed by the experience. And that's actually pretty extraordinary. I don't know if you're like me, but if you read a really terrific review of a movie, Sarah, before you go to see it, it's often very difficult to enjoy the movie because you keep saying to yourself, well, must be a great movie, why isn't it, doing something to me? And the fact that they go and they've already heard such positive things makes it even more difficult to satisfy them, but this is a consistent finding. We should lock the door. Okay, so what is it? I'm not going to sit, so you're welcome. What is it that they learn? So first of all, they learn about the natural environment. They learn about the land. They think they learn about Israeli culture and lifestyle. They learn about Jewish history. They learn about modern Jewish history. The lowest on the list, and it is one of the difficult problems that this program as a Jewish education program faces, is how to teach about the conflict. For security reasons, groups do not, as part of Taglit, travel over the Green Line. There are a few exceptions. Every bus has a GPS, and every movement is monitored. There's even some interesting studies about where they spend their time and where buses spend their time, but this is a key issue. That's the natural environment, as you all know. So what do people take away from the program? They take away from the program, and we ask a series of questions. Is Israel a militaristic society? Is it a fundamentalist society? Is it diverse? Is it a high-tech powerhouse? We ask them some other questions, but these are the most interesting. I think in part because of the Chayalim who they get to know. And these are people, all but for, my grandparents who made a left turn instead of, going straight ahead. I could be in that uniform. I could be there. They're very aware of the role of the Army, the role of the military in life here. What's particularly interesting to me is that consistently people come away, American young people come away seeing Israel as a diverse, multicultural society. And they see a diversity of Judaism and a diversity of Jewish culture that is, whatever they have known about Israel before, surprises them and interests them. They do learn about the conflict, and actually one of the interesting pieces of this, and it does relate to the political issue, is that they will meet the soldiers who are part of their mifgash, and they will find that these soldiers, that these people defending the country, that some of them have left-wing views and some of them have right-wing views, and some of the people sometimes have left-wing and sometimes have right-wing whatever, and that dialogue and debate and discussion doesn't stop, and so they're sometimes they have difficulty understanding, if you will, the cacophony of opinions and the way in which Israelis debate issues. One of the questions that keeps getting asked is, and it's not an answer to, but it relates to the question that was asked before, is when people come back, do they feel confident in talking about Israel, representing Israel, particularly those who are on campus? And as you'll see, and I actually think this is healthy, they don't feel very confident about talking about Israel. I think even some of them who come thinking they understand the political situation, some of them who think they come understanding what Israel should do or not do. In some ways, the program increases the number of questions that they have, and from my educational perspective, that's a good thing. So, I'm gonna, most of the data that I've showed up to this point has simply been of the alumni. When I started to do the work on Taglit, again, I'm a social psychologist, I'm a Lewinian social psychologist. I believe that you study things by trying to change them and see how people respond. I made a presentation to Steinhardt and Bronfman in 1999 before they began the project. And I said, you know, you've got the opportunity to create, and what you've done is to create a large-scale social experiment. And that it behooves you to study this as, and using the best methods that we have available to study social innovation and change. And so I proposed to them that they do what would be called in the medical world a randomized clinical trial. I said, you're offering this program for free. There are going to be twice as many people wanting to go as you're going to possibly be able to serve. I think we should compare. I want to compare the people who go with the people who don't go, and I want you to use a lottery system to figure out who should go on the program and who should not. So I make this presentation, first time ever I'm in the Bronfman, the then Seagram building on Park Avenue in New York, a very beautiful conference room. And even before I finish describing what I want to do, Charles Bronfman interrupts me and says, I'm sorry, Professor, I'm not spending my money to study people who don't go on my program. Steinhardt interrupts Bronfman and says, no, Charles, I know what this professor wants. He wants to do a rigorous study. I'm not going to spend my money to find out that we were unsuccessful. And not knowing either of them, I said to Steinhardt, I said, Mr. Steinhardt, I understand you've put $5 million of your own money into this project. Are you telling me that you don't want to know the correct answer to whether this has had any impact? I was on a roll then, so and I went on and I said, what is it about Jewish education that makes it less important, less significant than anything else in education and healthcare and so on, that we wouldn't want to use the most rigorous, the best methods? So Steinhardt turns to Bronfman and says, he's right, we're going to do it this way. So the rest is history, and for the last 11 years, we've been following both the people who go on the program and the people who don't go on the program who apply. It was interesting, one of the ways I was able to do this at the beginning was that nobody believed that there would be as many people wanting to go on the program, and if I had Danny Kahneman's work and the huge systems of decision-making and action, my system one thinking, my intuitive sense of this was that the whole world was going to jump at the opportunity to get a free $2,500 trip to Israel. And I was correct. One of the reasons I got away with the study is because the people designing the program didn't think that anybody was going to show up to their party. In any event, these are still data from some long-term impact. We've done studies 6 months. We've done studies pre-test, post, essentially pre-test, post-test, pre-program, post-program, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 36 months, and we're now doing studies 5 to 10 years after the program. So this is just pulled from our long-term data, and it really is quite extraordinary that in this case, these are 2001 to 2004 cohorts. The data were collected in 2009. So this means after 5 years, and this is the question, how much did the trip make you feel closer to Israel, your Jewish heritage, the Jewish people? Overwhelmingly, you don't see these kinds of findings. If I saw them in my course evaluations, if we ever did course evaluations, even like a month after the course, I would be thrilled with these kinds of data. And this is consistently what we find. Everybody understand? Questions? Anything? Now, this is the first of the comparative studies. And so I'm going to call one group non-participants. These are people who applied to the program and then didn't go. These are people, obviously, who went, essentially the Bogrei Taglit. At baseline, and we know a fair amount about them, both Jewishly and otherwise, because they have to fill out an application to go on the program. There are absolutely no differences between the non-participants and those who actually go on the program. And one of the reasons that they wouldn't do a pure lottery, that was too academic, that was too abstract for them. But what happened is that because of the way the program operates, and it takes them, that they don't know until very close to the trip exactly what and when they have flights with seats available on those flights. What happens is that, for example, the kids, the participants who are here in Israel right now, and I think there are 6,000 or 7,000 from around the world, and most of them are in Yerushalayim today. They applied in early September to the program, but it wasn't until late October or November that they were told, well, we have a spot for you. And the way it went is, some people were told, well, we have a spot for you on December 22nd, and you'll be back, whatever, January 2nd. And the person says, well, I'm sorry, I've got a final exam, or I celebrate Hanukkah there, and I got to be with my family. And what happened is, just simply because of the logistics of the program, they ended up having a lottery-like system. So no differences between participants and non-participants at baseline. It's becoming more difficult to do this because there was so much angst about people who were put on waiting lists, that they now allow people, they give priority to people who've been turned down once to go on a later program. But in these early years, there wasn't any such thing. So these are the same people, and the only difference between, this is a dark blue line, this is a lighter blue line in theory, the only difference is that the group here, the group here, the group here participated in Taglit, and on the standard scale of how connected are you, how connected do you feel to Israel, there are huge differences, and they are consistent across time. They're even consistent despite the fact that there are different historical events, whether it's Aza, the flotilla, or whatever, cast iron, whatever the name translates to of the operation. And actually these, just for those who are paying attention to the statistical issues, these are estimated proportions, so we've actually done some minor post adjustments, but you get the same effect even if you use the straight numbers without any adjustment. Yeah?
This short term, how short term after the program is this?
Right. So this is anywhere between, there's at least 6 months, we never do a survey before 6 months, and in some cases up to a year. It's a little bit different between winter and summer. So like winter, it's a little bit closer because of when we have to do the survey. So, yeah.
Prior to that, he showed one of the columns showed 75% affiliation with Israel, connected to Israel. Now it shows between 50 and 55%. The one before, you could see says 75%. Maybe it was done over a longer spectrum. Yeah, no, up. One up. Maybe it's kind
Next
of
one.
a different spectrum of time, but
That's long term.
that's a long term. How can you explain that in long term do you feel more connected than short term?
No, this is a different question. This is how much did the trip essentially change you, not how connected do you feel. So you could even be not a whole lot connected, but the trip could have changed you a lot. So for example, there's it's called a graphic novel. Basically, it's a book-length comic book that one participant, her name is Sarah Glidden, has written about Taglit. And it basically starts out how she goes being very skeptical of you Israelis and very skeptical of what's going on here. And one of her reasons for going on the trip is to find out and to really meet these terrible people who have done all of these horrific things to another group of people. And by the end of the book, as a result of the mifgash, she has an entirely different perspective on Israel and on Israelis. So she would be somebody who would have changed a great deal, even though, actually in her case, I think she might describe herself as feeling very connected, but that's not necessarily the case. But these are two different questions. Other? I like skeptical stuff. So this is just, and in some ways this is, I'm being a little bit unfair here because I picked out two measures, both attachment to Israel and marriage, which are the most dramatic of the findings. So not everything is quite as dramatic, but this is a dramatic finding. So what this shows, one more. Okay. So what this shows is the following. So these are people who went on the trip 2001 to 2005. We interviewed them in 2010. So some of them, it had almost been a decade since they had been on the trip. Some of them it had been as short as 5 years. It's interesting, when we designed this study, we had assumed that by age 30, the majority of the participants would be married. It turned out that wasn't the case. The majority don't get married now till about 31 or 32, and the problem in America is that the Jews are overeducated, so people keep going to school, and that leads to postponing marriage. But of those who were married, and removing from the analysis the Data'im who participate, and there were a significant group of Dati participants, particularly during the Tzav, the Intifada years, when other programs were unavailable. But removing them, so this is only the non-Orthodox, what you see is an almost 50% increase in the rate of in-marriage between non-participants and participants. And what that means is that those who participated, and there is again nothing else different about these people at baseline. These are actually, there's some minor adjustments for who we got in the final sample. But the only thing different about the group on the right is that they participated in Taglit-Birthright Israel. Now, what's going on behind this? And I should say one other thing about this. Some people, even those who are positive about diaspora Jewish life, would say this rate of 50% in marriage, that's pretty high. We think the majority of young Jews in America are not marrying Well, it turns out one of the reasons that that rate is so high is because even though they're in our control group, they didn't ask us for permission to do this, but even those people in the control group essentially are marrying participants. And the dynamic of it, and it will sound, I'm not embarrassed to tell you this, but it sounds odd to say, people come back and they tell us, I stepped off the plane in New York and I decided that being Jewish was important to me, and I knew that the most important way of continuing to be Jewish is to marry another Jew. And so they come home seeking out people to date and to form partnerships with who are Jewish. There is also in this group, they meet lots of other people, and we've actually asked them about their social relations and so on, and they meet non-Jews all over the place. They have their rate of having non-Jewish partners convert to Judaism is 5 times what the rate is for non-participants. Okay, questions about this? Yeah.
The question of the same baseline background between the participants and the non-participants, are they all in your data group? Are they all children of 2 Jewish parents?
No.
They're not.
No.
In other words, that wouldn't be something that would skew the in-marriage figure upward.
Right. So it's a great question. So if Stephen Cohn were here, he would force me to answer this regardless. The proportion of participants from intermarried families is probably lower than the rate in the population at large. It's the one really distinctive way in which those who apply to Taglit are different. But there are 20 to 30%, there are over 20% who have a non-Jewish parent, and there's another 10% who have a non-Jewish born parent, in other words, a conversion. It's really extraordinary. When you look at the rates, we don't quite have enough people yet, because not enough people, we will within 6 months have these data, but not enough, there are not enough converts, or there are not enough children of intermarried parents who have married already in here for it statistically to be reliable. But the evidence that we have is that the impact of Taglit is much greater on the person from that intermarried family, even though the effect of Taglit is across the board. So for someone who went, whose family was, say, a member of a Masorti shul, and they were a bar bat mitzvah in that shul, if you will, their natural rate of in-marriage might be 60%. As a result of Taglit, it's 80%. Whereas for intermarried kids, where the natural rate might be 20 or 25%, children of intermarried parents, Taglit pushes that over 50%. So you got a 50%, you got a huge increase there of over 100%. Yeah.
So, just to clarify, so when you're talking about 50 and 75%, does that include the converted partners, or that's a different?
Oh no, that includes, in other words,
So the partners.
in this case, I'm following halakha, right? So it's if
If they converted halachically, they're Jewish, right?
right. So if they convert, right? Although we don't worry about whether the conversion is a halakhic conversion, we don't ask people. The question is, we ask people, did you convert to Judaism? But we won't distinguish whether it was a Reform rabbi or an Orthodox rabbi or what have you. Yeah.
In that sense, I don't want to sound gloom, but you know what? I mean, in a way, you say, yeah, maybe 20% of the participants are non-Jews, and for example, out of these 20%, because your Jewish identity isn't as strengthened as the more traditional.
Before you go on, it's not that 20% are non-Jews. 20% have a non-Jewish parent.
I take that back. Non-Jewish parent, which let's say 50% of them means for just out of the blue means only 10% of them are really halachically non-Jewish? Probably, I think it's a higher number though. And you say out of these 10%, 20% would normally marry to a Jewish spouse. But since Taglit has came into the picture, out of the participants, it will rise up to 40, 50, even higher percentage. The question is, and I would like, I mean, no value judgments made, is how on a more traditional inline forces in action in Taglit sees that, maybe can view that as like almost intermarriage, that they're taking people who, some of them might not be halakhically Jewish, and through Taglit, these people are marrying Jews, which is actually by Orthodox Judaism causing more assimilation. What would you say about that?
So I'd say two things. First of all, I want to step back. My reason for paying attention to in marriage is not because it's not for religious reasons, if you will. My religion, for purposes of the research I do, is to do good psychology. And what we were looking for was a behavioral measure that would indicate those identity, would give us a clue about the identity measures. It's too easy for somebody who's accepted a gift of a $2,500 trip someplace else to say, I love Jewish, I love being Jewish. I wanted to look at their actual behavior, and it seems to me that the most important way to measure a young adult and adult's engagement with their identity, with their religious and cultural identity, was to look at marriage. So for me, and the purpose of showing it here is not to entertain the halakhic
So you base it
discussion.
on an identification model, the way
so-
the subject.
So identifies. Now,
Save some of the questions for the
Yeah.
second part.
we'll come back to that.
I have one question, which is, the non-participants are still people who signed up for Taglit in the first place,
Right.
right? So the third graph bar line that's missing here
Are the people
are
didn't
people
sign up.
who didn't sign up, because I'm wondering if, it's nice to see that improvement, but I would wonder if already the people who are signing up for Taglit are sort of already
Well, actually-
high up on a scale.
Actually, that makes this I think it strengthens the point. I'll argue the methodological issue for a moment. If in fact the people who apply to Taglit are the more highly engaged, then the fact that there's a 50% increase as a result of the program is even more surprising and startling. Now, as it turns out, what happened, in particular in 2001 to 2005, is that the Chaval, but the Intifada, Matzav, actually brought into Taglit a whole group of people who had no interest whatsoever prior to the program in their Jewish identity. And what happened is that, particularly for males during that period, Israel became an exciting place because, it's horrible in some ways to say, because of what was happening here, it was an adventure. It was something that they wanted to do. There were times, by the way, in 2002 and 2003, when the majority of the participants were reporting that they came over the objections of their parents. And that's pretty extraordinary. Now, it may also be one of the things that made the program more important, because they made the decision themselves. They perceived this to be a dangerous experience, and that may have enhanced it. So, Taglit in general, just to go back, in general, Taglit gets a pretty wide group of people. I've sometimes described it as Noah's Ark. There's at least 2 of every species and subspecies of American young adult Jews. They're not quite in the exact proportion that they exist in the population, but maybe Sergio Della Pergola knows, but most of the rest of us don't know what the real exact proportion is in America of people. So it's a pretty diverse group. The one exception, and it was raised before in the question, the one thing that we do know is that children of intermarried parents are slightly less likely to even apply, and that is because it is so difficult for the non-Jewish spouse or the non-Jewish parent to accept the fact that their kid is going to come to Israel. Okay, I'm almost finished, and we can open it up for broader discussion. So I want to talk for a moment about Taglit as Jewish education with Israel as the context. We'll talk about Cancun in a second. So first, I told you I was a Lewinian social psychologist. One of the reasons that Taglit works is that it provides this setting in which you can unfreeze behavior and attitudes by putting people in a different setting. You can really sort of start over again. You can, in some ways, erase all of the bad memories of Hebrew school and all of the other connections to Jewish life and start over again. It fosters normative change, and it gives participants an opportunity to enact their Jewish identities. For too many young Jews following bar bat mitzvah, there really are no ways for them, whether it's to use Hebrew, whether it's to use the knowledge that they have learned. One of the questions keeps coming up, and I'm a scuba diver, so this is a particular interest to me, is it important that Taglit takes place, Arons? Could you do the same thing? I'm sorry to move around so much and screw up the camera. Could you do the same thing, taking people to one of the spots that I have not been yet, that I would like to go because the diving is great, Cancun, an island in the Caribbean? Would you have the same effect? And I keep asking Michael Steinhardt to fund me. Right, so I keep asking to be funded, and I've gotten all kinds of volunteers to be madrachim and so on, but I can't do it. So what I think is that perhaps it would work, actually bringing a group of young Jews together because of social networking, we'll talk about that in a second, does make a difference, but it wouldn't be the same thing. That the land, the language, the people provide context, give Taglit a content message over and above the process message of learning with people who share your religious and cultural identity. I want to talk for a moment about Taglit as experiential Jewish education. One of my, as a non-educator, as a social psychologist looking at education, I keep coming back to I'm using Lee Shulman's terms, hard head and hand. I've translated it sometimes as the Kishke's cortex and kinesthetics principle, that education to be effective has to be emotionally engaging, affective, has to be cognitively stimulating, that's the cortex, and it has to involve behavior. And the problem that we have with most education, including university education, is that we touch only one or two of the three modes. What distinguishes Taglit is that it touches all three. And as I've watched the More Derek and the others who were involved as educators in Taglit, the really good ones, I call it, they know when to walk and they know when to talk. And they know how to manage the emotional temperature of the group, along with providing the cognitive stimulation and the actual physical stuff. Again, in terms of Jewish identity, what makes Taglit unique is that it is both the context and the content in the same package. It creates social networks. I was telling people earlier this morning that I was go to this event every year. It's called Renaissance Weekend. Bill Clinton, former President of the United States, and some of his friends started it about 30 years ago. It's families from the academy, from government, from politics, and from the corporate world who get together over the secular New Year's. And it's my opportunity to meet non-Jews, and it's my opportunity to meet people that I don't often meet. Anyway, I was in a panel last week with a group of Christians, mostly some evangelicals and a bunch of ministers and priests, and the topic was, is faith genetic, and is being religious something that's genetic, or is it something that is learned? And after I listened to all of them talk about faith, I said, you know, as a Jew, I'm out of place in this discussion, because for me, Judaism is not a religion of faith. As a scholar, student of Judaism, it's not a religion of faith, it's a religion of behavior. And I used this expression, I said, for me, Judaism is a contact sport. It is our interaction, it is our relationships with one another that is the focus. It is building community and so on. I upset one of the evangelicals terribly that the people of the book, the people of the Bible would not see it in a literal way. Was very, very upsetting. I said to her, as a social scientist who studies what people think and what people do, it is the case that for Jews in America, for the most part, the majority engage in Jewish behavior without having a particular faith. It is our social networks, it is our communities which are important. So I want to turn finally, I want to go back, again, the computer here reversed the words. Interesting faux pas or whatever. This is the reverse of the negation of the Gola. What does it take to develop an attachment to Israel? And with several of my colleagues, we have a paper that's just about to appear in print, which is basically testing the life cycle versus cohort notion. And the idea here is that there's, as I said at the top of the presentation, there's a lot of discussion about whether Jewish young adults in America, whether Jews in America are distancing themselves, detaching themselves from Israel, from engagement with Israel. And one of the things that we've been looking at, and I will show you in just a second, is how attachment to Israel is really a developmental, psychological developmental process. You're not born feeling Ahavat Yisrael. You learn it, and it gets it's facilitated by both knowing Israelis and also spending time in Israel. And obviously, the older you are, the longer you live, the more opportunities you have to do that. What Taglit does is it hastens the process of attachment. To the extent that we get in a very short time in America, North America, to a point where the majority of Jews will have visited Israel before they become full adults, before they start their families, will really be revolutionary. And what we are finding is that, and I will show you this in a second, that it is transforming the American Jewish community vis-a-vis Israel, but it's also transforming the American Jewish community in terms of how Jews feel about their identities. So very quickly, one of the things that we did is to take a look at every study that we could get a hold of that was done in multiple waves So we looked at the National Jewish Population Surveys, this is the 90 and the 2000 survey. And then we've actually looked at almost a dozen different surveys that have been done at multiple intervals. And what you see here is that for each generation, this is the generation born 63 to 72, 53 to 62, and so on, what happens is that over time, this is actually alienation. It was easier to do for the negative. Basically, how little are you attached, or how unimportant is Israel to you? Basically, what we see is that as you age, you essentially increase your attachment, if you will, decrease your detachment, and it's more pronounced the younger that you are. This is, I should have done that, the percentage not at all emotionally attached to Israel. Here's another data set. This is from two different studies done in the Boston Jewish community in 1995 and 2005. And you see this same exact pattern, this decline in negative attitudes essentially indicates an increase in attachment over time. What is particularly interesting is that this is from our Taglit studies. We call it now the Jewish Futures panel. So these are the non-participants, and these are the participants. Significant increase between participants and non-increase, significant difference in the level of attachment. But what's particularly interesting here, is that we've compared this to a national sample of adults, of people from 18 to 90 plus. And while the pattern that we find in this study is the typical pattern that as you age, your attachment, your connection with Israel increases, what we also see here is that for the people who participated in Taglit, they look like 60-plus-year-olds in terms of how connected they are. And even the non-participants, and for this particular study, we think that we have a little bit of bias in the non-participants, that the people who were rejected from Taglit, when we come back to them 10 years later, it is very hard to get them to respond to us, partly because maybe their anger, but also because they're so detached from Israel, they're so detached from Jewish life that they don't want to answer a survey, they don't want to be interviewed about their Jewish connection. So, I think we have some very strong evidence that makes clear that Jewish education does make a difference, both in the strength of Jewish identity and in the relationship of American Jews to Israel. That even if we're off by a few percentage points here, the differences are so large and the changes are so large that it's hard to ignore them. And I'll just end by saying, and this is the connection to Zionism, to Israel, Louis Brandeis. I teach at Brandeis University. Louis Brandeis was the first Jewish Supreme Court justice in the United States, but was also an outspoken Zionist, or became an outspoken Zionist. And for Brandeis, who believed in the fundamental values of America and principles of America, for him, as he said here, to be good Americans, we must be better Jews, and to be better Jews, we must become Zionists. I think today, what this means, because who knows what Zionism means any longer, it's perhaps a projective test, Israel and the culture and the tradition of Israel is central to American Jews, and Jewish education has a central role to play in both promoting Jewish identity and the attachment of diaspora Jews. So thank you.
Thank you for this most interesting and insightful presentation. In fact, I wish to indicate that when we had dinner the other day, Professor Saxe asked me for my assessment of how many people will attend this talk, and I said that it's somewhat difficult to know, but I assume probably somewhere in between 15 and 25. So the fact that this room is so crowded with something like 50 people, I think speak for ULAN and for the significance of the project of Taglit.
Don't forget you promised us beer.
Yeah.
It doesn't say anything about Uzi's skill as a demographer, though.
Okay, so now we have approximately 20-25 minutes for questions. I suggest that we try and collect 4 or 5 questions.